What the hell is going on in the Middle East? There's a ceasefire in Iran, but the Strait of Hormuz is still blocked on both sides. There's a ceasefire in Lebanon, but strikes are both being conducted by the IDF and Hezbollah. There's a ceasefire in Gaza and local elections, yet Hamas is now stating openly that they don't want to give up their arms. I'm Jacob Laznik, and in this episode of The Deep Dive, we're going to try to sift through the noise and try to get an understanding of what's actually going on with all of these fragile ceasefires, if that's even possible. To do so, we're joined by our senior Middle East correspondent, Seth J. Frantzman. Seth, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, as of right now, Israel's in a few ceasefires that some would say they don't want to be in, some are happy that they're in. But there's a ceasefire in Iran that Israel's kind of privy to. And there's a ceasefire with Lebanon that, somehow also implicates on Hezbollah. And meanwhile, if you look at the Gaza Strip, they're also, at the same time, they've had some local elections, but they've also said that they don't want to give up their arms. So we're kind of in this precarious, everything is calm. Do you think it's going to hold, or do you see that any of these are going to erupt soon?
Well, it's kind of like ceasefire roulette is the picture that you're painting, right? You never know which one the ball will land on. I think that, this is the weird situation that Israel is in, which is it has all these ceasefires. A lot of them, or some of them, are kind of contingent on what the United States does. So Israel doesn't even have a ceasefire with Iran. It's just the United States has a ceasefire with them. I mean, Israel, was involved in attacking Iran last June and then this time in February with the Americans. But, apparently that war's, in a sense, ongoing. It's just a question of when the United States will decide yes or no. I think you hear from Israeli politicians, that they'd like to keep doing things.
Right.
Again, not really clear what the strategy is, but that's what they'd like to do. And then you've got the Lebanon ceasefire, which is now the second time there's a ceasefire, because remember, the first one was November 2024. Again, it's not even a real ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. It's a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon.
Right.
Hezbollah is not even mentioned, so it's kind of strange because the thing that Israel's actually fighting is not even mentioned in the ceasefire. Again, it's a U.S.-backed agreement, and it seems to be tied somehow to the Iranian ceasefire with the Americans, because apparently the Iranians wanted Lebanon included. So you have a kind of strange ceasefire there, although it's not really a ceasefire because there's attacks every day. I think just a day ago, a drone killed a civilian Israeli contractor who was in Lebanon working as an engineer with the IDF. So that doesn't sound like a ceasefire, people being killed. And then you've got the other one, you said in Gaza, which is since last October 13th, I think. That seems to be going okay. I just wrote about how the Kosovo sent 5 or 6 soldiers down to Gaza with the International Stabilization Force to kind of scope out what they're going to do there. That would stand to reason that Kosovo and other countries, I think Albania may be involved as well. Those countries think that this is going to stick. Okay,
so I guess that's optimistic and good to hear. Going back to Iran and Lebanon, I think like the more important question here is, like, would it really have to boil over? Like, would there have to be a incident to set something off if the ceasefires themselves aren't really so much of ceasefires?
Well, I think we have to understand the Iranians are playing a very strange game here with what's going on. The Iranians are basically pretending that they have no real leadership in Iran because, Israel and America killed the last Ayatollah, and then his son is badly wounded or something. It's not clear, so it's not really clear who's in charge. And then there's got this whole thing of the Iranian foreign minister this week is running around Moscow hanging out with Putin.
Right.
And so he seems to be, portraying it as like everything's normal. I'm still the foreign minister. But then you've got the fact that the internal part of the regime pretends that there's just no one to talk to.
Right.
And I think Trump has basically said, it's a total chaos there. We just don't know. He keeps threatening them, but Trump has also kind of understood that, okay, what's the point of threatening this entity that can't ever come to the table? Then you hear from the Iranians that, in fact, what they'd like to do is have a deal with the Americans to open the Strait of Hormuz so they could get their oil flowing again or whatever and make some money. And that would help the Gulf and help the Americans because they don't want to pay the price at the pump. But the question the Iranians are saying, but let's just kick the can on the road with a nuclear discussion, which if you look at the Israeli point of view, Israel has always, ostensibly cared a lot about the nuclear file and now the ballistic missile file.
Of course.
So it just leaves you, you leave wondering what's really going on. Well, the Iranians appear to be playing a kind of shell game, where you have cups on a table and there's a ball in one of them. And the Iranians keep moving the ball around saying, but why don't we talk about this cup but not that cup? So I think it's a bit perplexing, and I think it's perplexing for the Trump administration because the Trump administration, I think, would like to get to some sort of a deal. I think from the Israeli perspective, if you hear what people are saying, at least the leadership in Israel, they don't really care about the deal. They'd like to continue the military operations.
Right.
Israel doesn't really think Iran will ever give up the nuclear material, but it's not really clear how you get the material out. So there's a theory in Jerusalem is, well, we just keep bombing them. I personally think that it's not really clear what the point of that is because it's not really clear what the strategy is. But I think if you hear from the rhetoric of the people talking, they say, no, we should just keep doing that and then just kind of see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, Iran's negotiation tactics really befuddle me. I really don't understand them at all. This also applies to the previous time when they were talking to the Trump administration and they had like a 60-day deadline for a deal, and the way they conducted that also made no sense to me whatsoever. Something that's been coming out recently that I thought was interesting, if it's true, it might just be complete BS, is the Trump administration has said through multiple avenues that they're kind of trying to paint this picture that, you mentioned the infighting in Iran, that there's two factions in Iran. There's like a moderate and there's an extreme faction. And they also say like, we've killed all the previous leadership, so we've kind of automatically done a regime change. Do you buy that, or do you think it's still the exact same old Iran just kind of running headless?
Well, Iran's government has always been a bit perplexing because you've got the fact that it's a religious theocratic state, which is run by the Ayatollah, who's now dead, and then there's another one or whatever. And there is obviously a religious establishment.
Right.
You've also got the fact that Iran has the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a kind of pseudo-military Praetorian Guard, which functions, as it's not only a bit religious, but also obviously as a militant organization. We're talking, hundreds of thousands of people are members of it or whatever,
yeah.
if you consider all the militias they have. Well, that's kind of a state within a state, right? So they've got that going on. Then they've got the actual normal partly Iranian state, which is what we think of as any government in the world. They have a president, they have a foreign minister, they have a government, they have a parliament, and it all kind of functions on paper. It's even a democracy on paper, right? So it kind of looks like things that are very normal. It's a very perplexing state because if you look at the president himself, he seems to be kind of a normal person that, if you dropped him to run another country in the world, he'd be kind of just a person. He'd be like, well, that guy's not a religious fanatic.
Right.
He's just a guy. I think he comes from a technocratic background or something, right? So you say, okay, well, that kind of part of the state, well, why can't we work with that? I mean, and that's when you run into this whole weird thing of the moderates and the hardliners and blah, blah, blah. The thing is, the problem is that the quote-unquote moderates or whatever those people are that run Iran, they don't have the real power to make the deal. The people that actually have the power behind the throne are all the people that are what would be considered hardliners or extremists or whatever. And a lot of these people, depending on their age, some of them were younger, like in their 20s, during the Iran-Iraq War. They would have been young around the time of the revolution, say 1820, whatever. Then they would have been coming of age during the Iran-Iraq War, which was quite a brutal conflict. So they were kind of like thrown into the fires of hell and came out of it, maybe, much more steel, but in a way much worse and more extreme. And so now 40 years later, they're running the country, some of them.
Right.
Well, their perspective is, we don't really care if the Americans bomb us. We think the Americans are the great Satan anyway, whatever. They always thought there was going to be some sort of apocalyptic war with America. So, you're just dealing with, I think, very different sets of people, some of which don't really mind if the country, sinks into disaster, and they kind of have a martyrdom that they want to have. They look forward to that. But then you have, obviously, the vast majority of people in Iran that actually are just kind of normal people and would like to have a normal government. They would probably like to have perfectly normal relations with everyone else. So it's an extraordinarily, it's a country that I think, in terms of governments, doesn't seem to look like any other country in the world at the moment. I mean, it might look like something, 1,000 years ago or something, where you have some sort of state where there's a religious theocratic leadership or something like the Crusader states or something, but then the average person is just like a random peasant or something.
Yeah.
But it doesn't look like anything else. And I think that's why the West finds it very difficult to deal with it, because it's like, it's just not having a talk.
It's not a framework that you can...
Right. And the West has always had this problem when dealing with other civilizations, whether it's dealing with the Russians or the Chinese. It's always had a problem that dealing with non-Westerners and not knowing understanding how they think and not understanding their societies.
And do you think, given this, does this mean that, the Strait of Hormuz is, the only kind of feasible, tangible topic that could be disagreed upon? Because that's actually something that both sides at any given moment could actually, tangibly affect? A lot of people feel that, the war has shifted to, the war over the Hormuz and rather the war over, nuclear or ballistic missiles.
Well, it's a super interesting thing that Hormuz became the way the Iranians were able to shift this, right? The Iranians, they're smart in this respect. the Americans have these demands, which are, in a sense, Israel's demands. And I think the State Department recent post that they put up about the war's background, America did go to war in large part or some part because they wanted to support Israel. So there is a direct connection. And Israel and the Americans don't want the nuclear stuff there. They'd like to have the enriched uranium removed somehow. I mean, as difficult as it may be. And they'd like the ballistic missile program to stop, but that's, again, very difficult to do. I think the Iranians were really smart in a sense, and I think everyone kind of knew they were going to do this because the Iranians had threatened for years that they would close the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
So the idea that it was kind of a surprise is interesting, just because the way the war was entered into, there wasn't apparently, it seems to be some thought process about the grand strategy.
Right.
But, like, the Iranian regime said, okay, fine, you want to bomb us. Okay, we don't have air defenses. We can't stop that. Well, what we can do is we can harass ships and stuff. And the thing about shipping is interesting. Shipping is done by companies, right? It's not so companies have very complicated issues related to insurance and things like that, right? So if a tanker is crossing a small body of water and there's even a 1% chance it's going to be attacked, obviously the insurance will skyrocket. And and usually what would happen is the company will say, okay, no, there's even a 1% chance, just don't do it. And so the Iranians don't actually have to sink lots of ships. They don't, they're not. No one's running the blockade here.
Yeah.
The ships are not going to. They don't want to run the blockade. They just want to sit and wait. And they've got 10,000 members of these crews sitting there, in the Gulf. There, just sitting. And the Iranians, by the way, do the same thing. They have a huge number of ships that are just sitting off the coast. It's just oil just sitting there. I mean, so, the Iranians just figured, look, we'll just drive up the pain, and the Americans will eventually cave. And, that's what the Americans kind of looked like they were going to do. They said, well, okay, we'll come to a deal. Then the Americans said, okay, we're going to blockade the blockade, which annoyed the Iranians a bit because I don't know if you recall, but the Iranians had said at one moment, oh, that's fine. Okay, we'll open the straits. There's a ceasefire. But then the Americans were like, well, we're not going to end the blockade. And the Iranians will said, okay, fine, so we'll close back. Yeah. So it's a really weird strategy. But again, it's not like it's entirely new. The Iranians and the Iraqis did this in the 80s when they fought what was so-called tanker war, because Iran and Iraq were fighting a war, and then they started attacking each other's ships. And it was an incredibly complicated thing, but, the world will have to figure out how to sort that out.
So if we're talking like grander strategy, I think it seems that the strategy here on the U.S. and Israel's part is very confused, very not clear, given the state of how things are today, where we're kind of in this like Strait of Hormuz kind of mess. What would you put? I don't want to say put money on, but like, what would you think Israel and America's next step is? Do you think they're gonna have to pivot to open the strait at their losses, or do you think like, I know whatever side like says they want to do or whatever, but like realistically, like how do you think this is gonna play out? If I could ask that.
I think the Trump administration understands that there's diminishing returns to airstrikes, and they get it. And Trump, doesn't really like to just fight wars for the heck of it. I mean, he got into this war, which actually surprised him because his whole demeanor in terms of his last year and his whole doctrine was no more wars. Yeah. We don't want to deal with the Middle East. The Middle East is just a big, waste of blood and money, and it's just a terrible place. So it's interesting he got into this conflict at all, but I think he did get in because someone told him after the success with the Maduro raid in January.
Yeah, 5 minutes in and out.
They told him, we go in, we bomb this Iranians, these people will cave, we'll get a deal. You, Mr. Trump, will walk away as the greatest leader in American history because you solved this stupid nuclear problem that no American president could ever solve. And so that's a huge win, right? I mean, and of course, Israel will love you, and that would be great, and it's wonderful for everyone. And then, of course, it became much more complicated.
Clearly.
You get the sense from Trump that every day he doesn't know what the best way to get the deal is, but he sometimes tries to threaten the Iranians, and then he does things like say, well, it's okay, don't worry, I mean, we're going to sort this out. Or, there's been rumors that he might just kind of declare victory and say, well, we won anyway. Right. We already got regime change. It's fine. We don't care, but let's just move on. But then there's also stories you see where they say, no, the U.S. administration is gearing up for, years of a blockade. And Trump made a comment where he was asked by the press, well, when's it going to end? And he said, hey, don't press me on this. Vietnam War went on for 10 years. We can do this for a long time. So you just never know exactly what the policy is. I mean, I think from Israel's perspective, it's just completely different. I think Israel's current leadership feels that endless conflict on almost every front, whether it's Hezbollah, Iran, or Hamas, is good, and it might as well just keep bombing them. I mean, they tend to seem to think that precision warfare and bombing achieves things. Mm-hmm. so far, I think the jury's out because even though the Israeli leadership has said, well, we've changed the whole Middle East. I mean, things are things are different, but I mean, because Hamas is weakened and Hezbollah is weakened and Iran is weakened. So, yeah, okay, all this vicious, pieces of the Iranian octopus, or these have as I think Bennett may have compared it to an octopus or something. You cut off the arms, but they grow back.
Yeah.
I guess so. Okay, but what's the final thing? So I think I think there is certainly a difference because the United States seems to want to say, okay, we get to X, we get to a deal.
Right.
I don't think Israel's not a part of the party of the deal anyway. So it has a slightly different view of what was going to happen because I think Israel generally is pessimistic and a bit cynical, but also gets a sense that, listen, these bad people are never going to change.
Right.
There's no light at the end of the tunnel.
So given that, I asked this to Alex last time we did an episode, do you think there's a possibility that this kind of Dahiya doctrine, like mowing the grass every few months to contain a threat, could also extend to Iran? Could like months on, months off conflict with Iran become a new norm?
Well, I think that's what Israel's current leadership wants, but I personally don't understand what the point is because we've been seeing them mowing the grass for a very long time. I mean, that was the policy in Gaza, which everyone was told this works amazing. You see, we fight them every year or two, and it's cool, and then we go back to business as usual. The problem is the Iranian problem is, it's a bit different in Gaza, right, or the West Bank. It's they have ballistic missiles, so when there's a conflict with Iran, Israel's airport has to shut, the whole country has to shut down. Kids go home from school. I mean, can Israelis really be expected the rest of their lives to raise their children half the time at home? I understand that apparently from the leadership perspective, and some people, they think, well, that's fine. People are resilient. Too bad for them. Look, I think at the end of the day, it's not great for Israel. And I think at the end of the day, some people in Israel will then choose to leave eventually because I think they can't accept that. So I think it's better at Israel's, early Zionist leadership like Ben Gurion and Menachem Begin and the people that founded this country like Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan, they believed in the concept of, a quick lightning warfare in which you decisively destroy the enemy quickly, and then you stop, just like in 1967. And even the 73 war, which, by the way, people say, well, it was a defeat. Yeah, it was a defeat for like 2 days.
Yeah.
The 73 war was won in a week and a half. Arik Sharon was across the canal, and they won the war in 2 weeks. Extraordinary victory, actually, by the end of the war. Okay, it sucked in the beginning.
Right.
But it was actually a phenomenal victory for Israel. So Israel historically did really good. Then you get to
I'm glad you said, but I have arguments about that all the time. It drives me crazy when people.
73 war was a huge victory. Look, it sucked in the first. It's just like everything. The Russians lost in Barbarossa in the beginning of the Second War, but they got to Berlin, and that's what matters. So I mean, in the end of the day, 73 was a great victory for Israel. The 78 war, or what it was like a week long fight in Lebanon. Did you know the IDF covered more ground in a day in 78 than the IDF covered in a month and a half of ground fighting last time?
I did not know.
The IDF basically got to the Litani like in 2 days in 78. It was a different mentality of how to fight a war. It's not a question of good or bad. Each concept has its goods, and the war changes.
Right.
But all my point is that the early leadership of Israel saw zero benefit in endless long wars, and the current leadership of Israel seems to think that that's just the way you do things, or they think that the enemy gets a vote as well. And we can't fully defeat them. So let's just keep doing this. I get the sense that eventually Israel's going to have to decide to find some other thing to do.
I mean, like from a personal standpoint, the whole feeling of extended conflict is not fun. It's very tiring. It's very, just looming all the time. But so I would hope that would change. But I think ultimately it just becomes a point of like clarity and seeing an endpoint and seeing like at least having an idea of like realistically where we can get to, which a lot of times I feel like is also kind of...
Well, I would just point out the fact that the U.S. and Vietnam got dragged into an endless conflict and didn't really know exactly what it was doing over there. It was like, well, there's a domino theory, we got to fight the communists, what about this? And it went on and on, and there wasn't really a clear strategy. And most of the young men, I guess they were mostly almost men that fought in that war, that came out of that conflict, like Colin Powell and Norman Schwarzkopf, who then became commanders in the 1991 Gulf War, or basically, they came in with what was called the Powell Doctrine or whatever, which is you have to have clear, obtainable objectives, and you have to have a point. You have to know what you're doing. You don't just go there and fight Saddam Hussein and then fight in the desert for 20 years.
Right.
You go in, you say, we want to get to X. This is exactly how we're going to do it. We have overwhelming force. We do it, and then we leave. And the George H.W. Bush administration did a great job. Then you get to George W. Bush with Iraq, 2003, and all of a sudden, that Vietnam generation has changed a bit, and the Powell Doctrine is thrown out the window, and America gets sucked into this long war in Iraq. Which, if you look at Trump and some of these people, they are very critical of that.
Right.
Which would lead you to believe that, okay, so Trump must understand then, what are we doing?
Yeah, for me, it was like on day one, I heard like 5 different officials from the U.S. say like different reasons why this like war kicked off. So like from the get-go, it's just been like very confusing. But, you know, we're in it now. It's a lot easier to start a war than to end it. I think something that could be very interesting is if we look at like the wider region, that, you know, a lot of the Gulf states were also under attack. Saudi Arabia also got attacked. A lot of, you know, alliances might have shifted or whatnot because Iran didn't just respond to Israel and to U.S. military assets in the Middle East. They kind of attacked everybody. You know, the UAE really got pounded. Bahrain was under attack. Qatar got struck a few times, even sometimes in Saudi Arabia. So how has like the landscape of the Middle East shifted because of this? Because obviously, you know, all these countries were afraid of Iran as like a threat, as like a loose cannon. But now that these attacks were actually, you know, they were conducted, how has this changed like these countries, like their tfisa, like how they conduct themselves? Are they like more willing to get into conflict because they were dragged in? Are they less willing? Do they trust Israel and the U.S. more? Do they trust them less because they were dragged in? Like what does that look like?
I mean, I think the countries are all a bit different. I mean, remember, you've got Kuwait, you said Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Oman. I mean, they all went into the conflict with different concepts of what they wanted to achieve anyway, or what their perception of reality is. I mean, like Kuwait and Oman are technically, you know, portray themselves very neutral. They're
Right.
very, very wary of conflict and wary of what the Americans might do. The UAE, of course, with the Abraham Accords in Bahrain, they're very, very close to the West, more close to Israel. They have U.S. bases, so we know, you know, that's where they position themselves. Doha, Qatar is always the country that seems to play both sides. It's like a major non-NATO ally. It's very close to the United States.
Right.
But on the other hand, it also has very close friendships with the Iranians. So, of course, they share a huge gas field, so there's a reason for the friendship. But they've always tended to play both sides a bit. And then you've got the Saudis, which is, you know, the leading kingdom there. I mean, it's a huge Sunni military power, lots of money. It is, you know, considers itself the leader. So I think the question is, yeah, the war is a huge shakeup for the Gulf. I mean, they've never had a war like this. I mean,
Right.
except maybe you could say the 80s, but even that was a bit different. So they really were wary of this, and their economies are based on, you know, expats and tourism. They cannot accept having airports closed for months. It will destroy their countries, I think. So, and having the oil cut off is really not optimal for them either. So it's a big problem. I think the question is, you know, how have they emerged differently? I think they are more wary of the United States a bit. I mean, to some extent, I think they were surprised that this suddenly happened. They know they have to rely on the U.S., but countries like Saudi Arabia have always been willing to hedge a bit. You know, they're willing to work with China or what's called the BRICS groups of countries. You know, they're
Right.
always looking at other options. You know, and also the UAE, of course, has positioned itself a bit differently. It's close to Israel. And the reports from the conflict are that they're even closer now. But, and you know, publicly, you don't hear that from the UAE's Emiratis, and you actually don't hear any statements from them saying we love Israel or it's amazing. You mostly hear Israelis talk about that. I mean,
Right.
you hear the Prime Minister of Israel saying, "Oh, the Middle East has totally changed. I told you I'm going to change it." Okay, well, what do they say? Well, the Gulfies just tend to be very circumspect. They don't talk very loudly. They don't boast. They're very careful, and they think in their language. And they try to portray themselves, of course, as all getting along. I think, of course, they have different views. I mean, Qatar, for instance, is very close to Turkey.
Right.
Turkey's a NATO ally. Qatar is a major non-NATO ally. In the past, when the Saudis, for instance, were fighting with the Qataris a bit in 2017, not physically fighting, but, you know, arguing,
Yeah.
and the Saudis tried to cut off relations with Qatar, actually, the Turks sent troops to Qatar to protect them. So, you know, everyone understands, you know, when it comes down to brass tacks, the Gulfies are willing to do things, or there could be military confrontation. I mean, Saudi, for instance, intervened in Bahrain in 2011 in the Arab Spring.
Right.
They sent troops in. Why? Because Bahrain has a Shiite population to some extent, and it's a monarchy. So, you know, look, they're certainly complicated countries. I think they've emerged from the conflict. They weren't as damaged as they thought they might be. the fact that the UAE survived hundreds of attacks.
Yeah, I mean, they
And-
really got pounded. Like, I've
Yeah,
seen them.
but the country's functioning, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we're not hearing that people are fleeing the UAE, right? I
Right.
mean, some people left, and they say that okay, hotel bookings are down, whatever. Okay, of course it is, but no one there's not a sense of disaster. I mean, I think the countries actually have raised their heads now and say, okay, we could weather the storm, but yeah, they would like the storm clouds to go away a bit.
Yeah, I know that's fair. I just I was thinking of like the reality of actually getting hit by missiles or actually getting hit by drones is much different than like the looming threat. But it appears that they've kind of weathered it, and I guess they're happy with the current quiet, and they hope it turns into permanent quiet. But
Well, I look any time they say no plan survives contact with the enemy. I mean, every group, every country that is thrust into war is always surprised by what it's going to be like, and they don't know what it will be like. I mean, and it takes time for the country to get used to it. I mean, you think people in London hadn't been bombed before in the Blitz, right? But they got used to it. I
Right.
mean, human beings are resilient. People tend to get used to things. I mean, I think the Gulf Gulf certainly woke up, a big wake up call for them. But I think the air defenses in the Gulf were shown to work at a point of 90 to 100%. And what's amazing there is it's very similar numbers to Ukraine. Ukraine air defenses are able to intercept about 90 to 100% of Russian drone and missile attacks. And you notice during the war, who was it that showed up in the Gulf? Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, because the Gulfies said, okay, look, we're dealing with the same problem. Come tell us how to fix it. And I would say, by the way, in terms of the question of, well, how has this helped the relations with Israel? They may, of course, do all sorts of things quietly under the surface with Israel, but the guy that they turned to in the war was a Ukrainian,
right.
Not Israeli generals to run over there. I'm not saying, of course, that Israel talks to them quietly off the table, but
Right,
the
but
fact
was
is
on
the
the head- yeah.
Gulfies are still wary of big public relations with Israel, and that says something. Reports of how great the closeness is with the UAE and Bahrain. The fact is, they're not inviting Israeli officials over there in big public ways.
Right.
So, in the end of the day, you want to get to a point where actually it can be a warmth like that. And I think the Gulf is still a bit wary of that. And I think they're also not happy with what happened in the Gaza war.
Mm-hmm.
And they are wary of Israel's extreme far-right statements to some of the people in the government. So that's why I'm saying it's interesting the Ukrainians actually were the ones that they invited over there to fight off the drones.
Right.
And the fact is, to be honest, Ukraine has good air defenses, but Israel has the best air defenses in the world.
And we're closer.
Per capita.
Right.
I mean, so you'd think that they'd say, well, that's what you'd hear more about. And in fact, we haven't heard that much.
No, it's definitely interesting. And now if we go back into Lebanon, I think for me that's the most perplexing thing going on right now, because I don't really understand what's happening.
Neither do the Lebanese.
Yeah, like first of all, if we talk about how the ceasefire was implemented, blows my mind. Netanyahu was holding a phone call with his cabinet to discuss the ceasefire. Let's say that was at like 6:01 p.m. on a Thursday. 6:01 and 35 seconds, Trump announced on Truth Social that there's a ceasefire. And then on the phone call, his cabinet ministers had to say, why are we finding out there's a ceasefire from Trump? So already very murky, very confusing, not really sure what's happening. Then there's the issue of the fact that it's with Lebanon but not Hezbollah. And at the same time, there's also, there are these White House talks that are going with the Lebanese ambassador and the Israeli ambassador. So we're kind of trying to come to historic talks with a third party that's not taking responsibility for the threat. So how can this actually play out in a way that can actually stop Hezbollah from firing on Israel? Or can it? I can't square that in my head.
I think it would be difficult. I mean, look, Lebanon is a complicated country. It's diverse. It's not very big. Its military is weak. It's a country that since the 1950s has been hijacked by outside movements. And the reason for that is, again, because it's kind of a weak country and it's also diverse. It was Christian-led at the time. And so Muslim movements felt, look, we'll just take advantage of this country and use it. So you have the fact that the Nasser's Arab revolutionaries or whatever, Arab socialists tried to create troubles in Lebanon in the 50s, which caused Eisenhower to send in the U.S. Marines, which was very nice. And then in the 70s, of course, the Palestinians basically took over southern Lebanon and used it to attack Israel. And then there was a civil war, of course. So they basically destroyed the country to some extent. And then Israel invaded. And then, of course, in 1989, the Saudis stepped in with the Taif agreement and said, okay, why don't we all stop fighting? And the Lebanese were like, yeah, great, let's stop fighting. And all the Lebanese factions put down their guns, except for one faction,
Which is the relevant one.
Hezbollah, which said, no, we need to keep our guns because we have to resist the Israelis. Okay. So then in 2000, the Israelis left. And so everyone said, well, okay, why don't Hezbollah put down your guns? Thing is, once people have guns, they don't want to put them down. It's like this, so then they said, no, we have to keep doing this. And then, of course, in 2005, the Hezbollah killed the former prime minister of Lebanon, Rafi Hariri. That caused the Syrians to leave Lebanon, interestingly enough, but it caused Hezbollah to get massively stronger and then basically coup the country in 2008. So, the thing is, Lebanon, the trends are not good. I mean, the trends since 1950s are just not ever good. It's never trending. And the fact is, we had a war now. Israel had a war with Hezbollah starting October 8th, 2023, the day after October 7th. And Israel's been fighting them now for 935 days.
Right.
And Israel, Israel is killing lots of them, but the question, is it winning? I mean, they're still there.
Right.
So, and you mentioned this discussion with the prime minister, whatever, and like the fact that they didn't even know there was a ceasefire being declared. It's because Israel, unfortunately, is very good at tactics in Lebanon. It can kill lots of the enemy. It can destroy all sorts of things. It's just not really good at strategy. And then it has to wait on Washington to do everything. And then you've got this whole thing of these talks in Washington. But if you hear both sides, what they're saying is totally different.
Right.
The Israelis say, oh, we're going to have peace with Lebanon. It's great. It's a new Middle East, blah, blah, blah. The Lebanese say, no, we just want the Israelis to leave. Can you please leave? And we'll do the talks to get you to leave. There's no indication that the two sides have anything that they can agree on, really. And yeah, maybe it's true most of the Christians in Lebanon and the Sunnis sit around quietly, secretly at home and say, we don't like Hezbollah. Okay, but how are you going to get rid of them? Well, they don't have the weapons to get rid of them.
Right.
And now Rubio has made a very interesting comment, the U.S. Secretary of State. He said, what we should do maybe is train a vetted, Lebanese security forces that could confront them. Well, that will take years. I think, by the way, it's totally correct what Rubio said. I posted myself about it on Twitter a few times. Yeah, Lebanon needs to train like a Praetorian Guard or something to go after Hezbollah, but but that will take time.
No, like any functioning state needs a monopoly on power. That's
yes, it does.
Violence and whatever. Like
that's right. And so, but to get there, sometimes it takes a bit of time, right? I mean,
Right.
Israel had the Haganah or whatever, then it became a country, but
Exactly.
it took time to train the IDF to become what is now, of course, apparently the most powerful military in the entire Middle East and maybe in parts of the world. But it takes time. So.
Right. So, a few questions. First of all, is there any possibility that the talks in Washington right now can achieve like anything pragmatic? Or is it all just is there anything feasible, tangible that in some way can help the sides de-escalate and live happy? Or is it all just purely for show and has no...
No. Look, talks are always good. It's always good to talk. It's always good. The symbolism of it's important. I think the goal should be to have an incremental concept of what's next, so that you don't just talk for the sake of talking,
Right.
but you say, okay, now we're going to move to stage 2, then we're 3. We have goals. Each part has a goal. I think if you just what's happening now, where the two sides have these kind of general concepts. Israel says talks are great, it'll lead to peace. You say talks are great, it'll lead the Israelis to leave. Well, guys, this is, if you look at game theory or something, these are just not the same game.
Yeah,
So,
you need to stay on clash, otherwise you're just going to talk past each other.
right. And so that's the problem, is that you need, first of all, to have someone like a Rubio in the room.
Right.
He's very smart. And he's very pragmatic and very American in his way of thinking, I think. So he will say, okay, we need to do this, this, and this. Because I think if you just leave the Israelis and Lebanese up to it, it's not clear where they will get, just because they don't really on the same page, but maybe they can be moved toward that.
Yeah, and in some ways it's reminiscent of like when the U.S. talks to Iran. They're kind of talking, but they're talking at different angles for the sake of talking. It's not really a focused. Another thing that I'm personally not worried about, I don't think it's going to happen, but when Israel started its like deeper ground invasion to Lebanon this time, a lot of people were worried that we're going to kind of see a repeat in which Israel's going to, not permanently, but like for an extended period of time, occupy parts of southern Lebanon. Do you see that being a case in which this established line of defense that the IDF is occupying is going to stick for a while?
Yeah, I think it's going to be hard for Israel just to walk away from it after having put a bunch of work into it and losing some people. I think that
we have done it throughout the war already.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, there's two ways of looking at it. One is that they keep the security zone there for another decade or years until someone, it's a reason to leave. Another is that they just leave one day, but because they've destroyed, almost all the houses there, they basically say, okay, we don't want any people coming back in this area. So Israel will use air power to police that little area, and they we basically say, well, we're going to kill anyone that comes in.
Did it look like buffer zones, kind of like with Syria, right after the Assad regime fell?
The buffer zone is a bit different because what the Israel does is there's some civilians that live in the buffer zone. What the IDF kind of just drives in circles around them. And of course, the Syrians don't like it, but they don't much. They're not going to do much about it. I mean, it's a bit different. I don't think Israel hasn't killed very many people in Lebanon. In Syria, and I don't. Yeah. And they haven't yet come to the point of just bulldozing every house. Maybe they will. But the Syrians are kind of like, okay, let's see. We'll try to be nice. It's a bit different in Lebanon because the villages that are Shiite in southern Lebanon, which is most of them except for a few Christian ones, are just seen as extremely hostile. And also the theory that I guess Hezbollah built infrastructure underground and stuff. You have to go root it out. There's no problem like that in Syria. There's no evidence that there's any terrorist infrastructure. Right. So it really is just civilians there, and I think Israel's a bit careful not to try to push things too far. So the situations are a bit different. It's more about what happened in Gaza, where Israel's just bulldozed everything and created this kind of, this area that's just completely raised. Yeah. This yellow line. And then if Israel ever leaves that, I do think it would seem clear that Israel will basically tell them, we don't want any people coming back to within a mile of the border, whatever Beit Hanun is, it's like a few hundred meters or a mile. I think Israel will say we don't want to see any people there. Unlike the old days, by the way, when they used to protesters used to come up, farmers were literally coming up to the border, farming up to the line, which of course helped to lay the groundwork for the attack.
So I think a final question I want to pose to you, because it's come up a few times in this conversation that when we're talking about the status of the ceasefires and this weird limbo that we're kind of in, there's this kind of recurring theme about waiting for Washington's approval. A lot of Israeli politicians would say that especially conflict with Iran is the big one. It's super important. It's an existential conflict. It's something that has to be done. And even in this situation, there's still waiting for Washington's approval. Also, if we look back in the U.S., it was a few weeks ago. Obviously, it didn't go through, but there was a Senate vote about arms to Israel, limiting arms to Israel, and it was blocked, but it was blocked very narrowly. Is this showing a bigger case for Israel's need to establish kind of military independence or seeking additional avenues, or do you think the current arrangement is still fine and effective, and it isn't really kneecapping Israel in what it's trying to achieve or what it should achieve?
Well, I think the problem is it's kind of Janus-faced. I mean, the fact is that you hear those voices in Israel, I guess, mostly on the right or the far right, saying, this is holding us back. The fact is, it's Israel's government and the right and the far right that have actually made it so that they are so ingrained with American politics and the U.S. leadership that they rely completely on the White House for everything. They needed the White House to get the hostages home. They needed it, the White House for the ceasefire in Gaza. They need the White House for the ceasefire in Lebanon. They needed the White House to go to war with them in Iran. And this is completely different than how Israel used to wage war. When Menachem Begin decided to destroy the Iraqi reactor, he didn't ask permission. Right. He just went and bombed it. And then it says, okay, it's done. Too bad. When Israel went to Entebbe, by the way, to bring the hostages home, we didn't beg the Americans to it. Israel just went to Entebbe, got the hostages, brought them back. Right. So to be honest, Israel's in a weird situation now because it's even more entangled in some ways with America than in the past. But this is sold as the greatest partnership and alliance ever. And at the same time, you then hear complaints about it. So it's kind of weird to want the alliance to be the most entangled it's ever been, and at the same time complain. Right. Just decide on one or the other. I mean, and I think the Israel faces the road to Damascus moment, I guess, on that. I get the sense that the reality is that the leadership, and whoever, if there's ever a change in leadership in Israel, who knows, really wants this American relationship, and the whole complaints about it are completely unfounded. Israel wants this. The question that Israel needs to discuss as a strategic question is whether it should be getting so deeply entangled with America on all these fronts in terms of the ceasefire aspect. I think the problem, again, is because Israel has tactics and not strategy on all these fronts, the strategic aspect is always handled by the Americans. It's completely outsourced to America, the big picture. And then Israel
naturally they mediate for Israel because we've left it to them.
But it's a problem because I think Israel historically was a country that had strategic thinkers, and I think David Ben-Gurion or any of these people. By the way, those people would have all agreed America's Israel's best ally. I mean, Ben-Gurion and JFK, all these people, whatever. Yeah. Golda Meir and Richard Nixon. It's always been It's always been clear that was a close ally. The question is how to handle Israel's interests and objectives. And usually Israel said, we'll do this. We'll do the fighting. And if America has to swoop in at the end and work with the Soviets or whatever during the Cold War to come to a deal, because that's how Israel and America would usually work, which is the Israelis would fight the Egyptians and the Soviets and Americans would do the big talk.
Yeah.
Well, now there is no Soviets. There's just America. But I think Israel has to figure out how to wean itself in terms of needing the U.S. to always come to its savior in terms of the ceasefire aspect. Israel should get to ceasefires itself. But the military relationship with CENTCOM or the defense relationship like Lockheed and Rafael and Elbit Systems in Israel's defense industry,
Yeah.
that should continue to be extremely entangled. And it makes sense because these are, Israel and America are some of the most advanced militaries in the world. And that's great for everyone. But I think on the political strategic level, the kind of Clausewitz aspect of what is Israel actually doing on all these fronts, I think Israel needs to sort itself out a bit and decide what it wants. And then it has to get beyond just doing tactics and has to figure out how it can kind of step up. And Israel needs to be in the room,
Yeah.
Israel's never in the room when these... By the way, they just had a huge meeting in Cyprus with the EU. Israel didn't even show up. Well, they weren't invited. I mean, I guess, I don't know, but they don't... But the president of Syria is there. Why not the Israelis? Whenever there's talks at the board of peace, where is Israel? I mean, this is a problem that Israel has self-isolated, by the way, a bit. Israel's angry, fighting with the Ukrainians now about grain. Israel's arguing with the South Koreans, with Poland. I mean, you can't wake up every week with a diplomatic crisis. Israel needs to get back to having good diplomacy and being in the room and deciding that that's important and not just doing airstrikes, because airstrikes should only be done as a path to get somewhere. Yeah.
Huh. No, it's a lot to think about. It's not really this zero-sum game of independence or not. It's more of actually having a strategy. It's kind of the common theme I'm taking away.
Well, look, I mean, that's the thing. There's not, the arms industry in Israel should be in entangled with the United States. And I don't buy the theory that, well, they're going to cut off weapons. I think the vote in Congress had to do with, or whatever they were talking about, the D9 Caterpillars, whatever. Like, by the way, you can also get tractors from other countries. I mean, the D9 is a great system, but at the end of the day, I think look, Israel is making a lot of its munitions locally. I think everything there is okay. But again, Israel should also heed the criticism of the Democrats. I mean, and not become just viewed as a political Republican Party friend. You can't have politics based on partisanship. You can't have a country be your friend just because one party's in power.
Right. Countries
have to be friends, just like you saw with the King of England in Congress. America and the UK have been friends for hundreds of years. That's the kind of real friendship you want. So I think there is criticism from the Democrats, fairly so, about what happened in Gaza or things, and Israel should listen to that and try to work with that and not become part of this partisan battle that's not helpful for Israel and Washington.
And this is actually the last question, and maybe this is too optimistic, but this lack of clear decision making or strategy that you address, do you think realistically this is something that Israel has the ability to figure out and decide while it's in these conflicts and like very fragile ceasefires, or will these conflicts have to like fully de-escalate before they can even like think to actually kind of like look inward and fix this?
No, I mean, it's going to be a problem because Israel also has deeply divided internal politics, and there's going to be elections and all this. You never know. So
right.
It's hard. Yeah, it's very hard. You're right. When you're on the horse in the middle of the river to decide what to actually do about the river. So, I mean, Israel has a trouble, but I think also there is a worshiping in Israel, or a tendency among the rhetoric of the leadership sometimes, or the discussions, to kind of worship all this tactical stuff and brag about, well, we killed this guy. I mean, in Lebanon, we killed this other guy. We eliminated this guy. It's like, okay, but it's the forest for the trees. You can eliminate people all day long, but what? Okay, but what's the point? I mean,
right.
And I think the problem is that the leadership had got a bit addicted to this idea of winning is eliminating all these random people or blowing up tunnels. Winning is not blowing up tunnels. The fact there were tunnels to begin with is a loss.
Right.
There shouldn't have been tunnels in Gaza. So you're just getting back to square one. So I think that's a problem. But that's a big issue. I think it's not just Israel that's saddled with the lack of strategy. European politics is not so strategic either. It's not exactly the era of Helmut Kohl and Mitterrand. I mean, come on, and American politics is not the era of FDR and Truman and Eisenhower. The whole world has become a bit more minutiae. So it's not just Israel, but Israel has a lot more to lose. So it should try to have a bigger picture.
Great. Well, I'm still just as confused as when we started, but it really helped put a lot of things into perspective. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, as you can see, the situation is just as complicated as ever. We didn't come to any definitive answers, but I hope that you now think of the conflicts in a different way. We hope you enjoyed the content. If so, please join us next week for our latest episode. And in the meantime, make sure to stay up to date at jpost.com.